We'll start to make the actual smoke, muzzle, and jet effects in a bit, but first I'd like to cover a few of the modules that we'll be using so we'll have a little bit more creative flow as we're making it, and I don't have to stop at each one of the components of each module. So considering I just created a particle system from the hierarchy, this time I'm going to create an empty game object just to demonstrate the concept. And then I'm going to go to Add Component and type in Particle System. And this will create a shuriken particle emitter. Okay, so we see the regular modules. We'll be using another one here, a texture sheet animator, and there is plenty more to choose from, but most of these we will not cover. We will cover these in a later dynamics course. Right now I just want to introduce you to a few settings of the particle emitter to get you started with some basic effects for your game. Okay, so we covered this initial menu here, so let's move on to all of the other modules. Let's get started with the emissions module. Not a lot of stuff going on here, and most of these settings are fairly self-explanatory. So right up here, rate is defined how many particles per amount of time, which is measured in seconds, or measured in meters. If we increase the rate, how many are emitted, we will see right away that the amount of particles, no surprise there, goes up. Now, if I, for example, choose not 100 but 500 particles a second, we will see that the cycle will actually break and the particle emitter shuriken will release a series of particles and that will stop the cycle. This is because we've limited the amount of particles that will be emitted. And the reason we want to do that is because if we don't have as much control as to the effect of each particle, such as, for example, if we're using collisions and the particles are bouncing and we want to know, well, when should we kill these particles? If there's a certain amount of particles, when should I get rid of the oldest ones? Well, that's when we specify the parameter of max particles. If you think your system can afford a higher amount of particles, if you are using a lower resolution textures, you can bump this number up. But normally you don't want to go too high. 500 is already pretty high, but rules are there to break. So if I put, for example, here 10,000, we will no longer see this burst in each cycle. Okay, I'm going to go and put this down back to 10. Speaking of bursts, we also have this parameter. Now, I've got particles going on. I've got 10 particles per second, and I can also specify little batches of particles going out. Now, this parameter here, time, is measured within the duration here, so it has to be within that range. And this is the amount of particles that will be let out. So for example, I've got a cycle right now of 5 seconds for the entire duration of the cycle. If I say put in 2.5 for time and the amount of particles, let's do 200 just to make it a little obvious, we will see that for every single half cycle we will release a batch of 200 particles. Now notice I've got a plus here, meaning that I can add multiple batches per amounts of time. So if right at the end, let's do 4.9, I want to release another 200, and we will right away see these batches coming out, which I guess are somewhat reminiscent of smoke rings. Okay, moving on, shape. Here we've got a few settings, and right away we see a visualization of the shape that it is emitting from. In this case, a cone. For this cone, we've got several parameters. Angle, this will be the angle of this cone here. So if I increase it, the particles will be emitted and they will be sent in the direction of this line, of this vector that specifies the cone. So let's give that a try and just increase it. Okay, let's zoom it a little closer so we can see it. Okay, so clearly the particles are now going out at a wider angle. Radius specifies the radius of the base. So now more particles are being emitted from the base. And speaking from emission from the base, here it is. Where do we actually want to emit the particles? Do we want to emit it from the base of this cone or from the base shell, meaning from the circumference of this? So now we're really getting smoke rings. Third option, volume. So should it emit from the entire volume of this cone here? Fourth one is volume shell, meaning the edges of this cone. So actually each time we're emitting, you can pretty much see the outline of our entire shape. Normal direction specifies either the particles being emitted directly from the normal of this shape or from a random direction of it. And once again, we can also specify all of these options. Okay, now several more shapes to choose from. There's also sphere, and we see the visualization of the sphere here. We have a few settings that should be familiar by now. We've got emit from shell, which emits it from the surface of the sphere. Let's uncheck random direction so we can probably see that a little bit more clear. Okay, you can see the surrounding of each sphere. This is somewhat reminiscent of fireworks. Radius is the radius of the sphere. And there it is. And that's actually it for this specific shape. Moving on. Hemisphere. Same thing, only the sphere is now sliced in half. All the other settings are exactly the same, so I won't go over them. Box. Box is a pretty useful one. It's one of my favorites. It lets us choose the direction, and it gives us a volume from what to emit from. And it gives us a few handy parameters here in which I can define the volume of this box. Random direction does the same thing. And lastly, we have mesh, which then emits something from a mesh. Currently, we don't have a mesh, but let's say if we choose icosahedron, one of the default meshes from Unity, we will see that all of these meshes are now emitting from this shape. Okay, I'm going to switch this back to box. Box is pretty good. Okay, and we're going to be covering one more module here that's not currently listed, but we'll get to that once we're actually constructing the ship. It will be more relevant, considering right now we're actually not even working with textures yet. Okay, so render mode billboard, what does that mean? It means that every single time a particle is sent, it is facing the camera. So if I switch this to other settings, there's stretched billboard, which specifies the length of each of the billboards. So 3 multiplies it by 3, and this affects the scale, camera scale, and the speed scale of the particle, so how fast the camera is, and how fast the particle. Okay, and the normal direction, is it going to be facing the camera, or will it be facing away from the camera? This is defined from a 0 to 1 value. There's a couple more render modes. Horizontal billboard aligns the texture along with the Z and the X plane. Vertical does the same thing, but aligns itself with the Y plane. Mesh actually emits a mesh. This might be useful if you've got some rocks falling down and you want to attach actual geometry instead of just quad sprites. Okay, I'm going to switch this back to horizontal billboard. Excuse me, horizontal billboard in the render mode. A few of these settings we will cover later. And the material, well, the material, we've covered this in several lessons. This will determine the material of each particle. And we'll also look at that once we're constructing the airship. Sort mode is how in what order the particles will be drawn in relation to one another. Sorting fudge is if you've got several particle effects on top of each other, sometimes one can overlap the other one, and it can get you won't get the effect that you desire. Cast shadows is the particle cast or receive shadows, and max particle size simply limits the size of the particle. So 0.01 now gives us a very small particle. This is pretty much all of the modules except for one that I'll be covering in this lesson, and then we'll look at all of these other modules in a later course, considering this is just a crash course to get you started with Shuriken.